Between 1940 and 1970, roughly 80% of all the gains in the black population took place outside of the South.
Cue the intro!
Hey everyone, and welcome back to episode 15 of Hit the Road, a podcast where we talk about events in history that we find interesting. Today's panel of discussion is Mighty Men on the Move, or really the movement of people in the United States during various time periods. I'm your host, Grayson Morales, and today I'm joined with some special guests.
Boy Vob.
Ana Sana.
Not only are they my close friends, but they're experts at geography too. Today we got a special treat for y'all because we're going to cover 4 time periods: the 1600s, antebellum South, the Great Migration, and 21st century migration. So guys, you want to start off?
Absolutely.
Here we go.
One of the most important events in American history was the transatlantic slave trade. It was only a segment in a 3-part triangular trade in the world, but in my opinion, it was the most crucial. It was a systematic aggression, depression, oppression, and progression, with 10 to 12 million African slaves being transported to the Americas in the 16th to 19th century. It was only until the act prohibiting the importation of slaves that went into effect in 1808 that slaves weren't being mistreated like this.
Yeah, and what made it terrifying was that every global power back then was participating in it. You had the Portuguese with the caravels that used slaves on their sugar plantations in Cape Verde. You had Spanish conquistadors in the Caribbean with enslaved people. You even had the Dutch and French merchants controlling half of the trade and taking a gigantic percentage of human cargo. Queen Anne of Great Britain at the time owned 22.5% of the stock in a company that supplied 4,800 Africans for 30 years to Spain on a monopoly agreement, which is crazy. It is as if they weren't humans.
The most brutal part of it all was the Middle Passage. That was a stage of nearly 80 cruel days where Africans were being shipped to the Americas, quite literally. It's infamous for how dehumanizing it was. The ships were overcrowded, the slaves were packed and chained to tiers, and they couldn't even sit upright. This affected their spine and how they breathed. The heat in the ships was intolerable and diseases were everywhere. There was barely enough oxygen to breathe in these ships.
One man that I know who contributed a lot to our understanding was Olaudah Equiano. He was a writer and abolitionist, and his most prestigious work is the interesting narrative of the life of Olaudah Equiano. He talks about his suffering, and his most notable piece of writing is when he remarks, "I now wish for my last friend, death, to relieve me," showcasing how there was no hope for the better future.
Because of the slave trade, millions of Africans were scattered across the 13 colonies, and it only expanded from there to the American Revolution and plantation/labor work to forced operations. And that was only the first instance of actual migration.
It was a forced, festering wound on humanity, a vicious serpent coiling the life away of its victims and squeezing freedom away.
I like that metaphor you used. I'm surprised you didn't pass English.
Yeah, it's pretty tragic. Anyways,
So since you guys yapped about the slave trade, what happens afterward?
I think it was the antebellum South period, where economies became fully dependent on slave trade labor, and a lot of people were poor and slavery was at an all-time high. So naturally, people were frustrated and wanted to migrate elsewhere.
It sucks that they were forced to work during a time of immense agriculture.
Yeah, the systems were really restricting. You didn't have any choice.
Yeah, and the funny part was that all the white elite did was cause a huge group of enslaved people to protest by secretly mass migrating into the Northwest.
I remember learning in history that freedom seekers would suffer under harsh weather conditions and travel by foot or wagon to get away from towns and cities in the south. They utilized the help of conductors who would own shelters for them to stay and give them provisions to carry on.
Yeah, and I know that slaves had to use the darkness of the environment to ensure they wouldn't be caught, because catchers with guns and dogs would roam the areas for runaways, and if slaves were caught, not only would the catchers get rewards, but they would be heavily punished.
Grayson, do you know any particular figures who were really important to the migration?
I know one. Have you ever heard of Harriet Tubman?
Well, duh, she helped free 70 people.
And that was just the beginning. Over a decade, she made 13 separate trips and in her lifetime helped 300 plus slaves safely cross from the American South to Canada. She's genuinely one of the few women I look up to. The industrialization era heavily contributed to migration too, since there was a massive need for railroads because the US was increasing in size over time.
Oh yeah, one of the reasons why African Americans moved to the North was because of job opportunities in manufacturing, right?
Yeah, since America acquired lots of land like the Louisiana Territory, Texas, New Mexico, and Florida, they needed more people to help build railroads that connected the country.
Different black inventors helped contribute to the Industrial Revolution too in other ways, which helped inspire others in the South to come north and make great changes to America.
I can't remember anyone, but one person was Thomas L. Jennings.
That's right. He was the first African American patent holder in history. Something really amazing for the time.
It was for his unique method of dry cleaning, something different that showed black inventors branching out into American culture. Here's a quick break for our sponsor.
NordVPN, the best VPN of.
Let's move on to the Great Migration. So what was it?
Well, it was the movement of African Americans from the southern states to the northern cities. The Great Migration occurred between the early 19th century and continued until the late 20th century.
Okay, so why do you think it happened?
Well, Grayson, the Great Migration occurred for many reasons. One reason is that during World War I and World War II, there was a high demand for industrial workers in the north that couldn't be met. So these new demands for workers were filled up by African Americans.
Not to cut you off, boy Bob, but another reason includes the fact that the North promised better educational opportunities and less racial discrimination than the South. Overall, the North promised a better life.
The second phase of the Great Migration took place during the Great Depression. The huge increase in manufacturing brought more employment opportunities to northern cities as well as the western cities, and the post-war period saw many returning black military veterans settle in the north and western destinations.
Grayson, you know how they managed to get to the North?
Tell me about it.
Most people traveled by train as the railroad system was the most efficient and fastest mode of transportation at the time. Trains provided access to many of the cities where African Americans settled and found work in industries such as manufacturing, steel, and the automotive industry. Some people also traveled by bus or car, although these methods were not as common due to the high cost and limited availability at the time.
I must say, traveling by car was dangerous for African Americans because they would often be met with violence and denied from entering and using essential services such as gas stations and restrooms. Aslan, who was one person that was not recognized enough during this time?
Well, there were a lot of people that were not recognized, but one person I could say that moved during the Great Migration and had a successful career once she moved was a woman named Betty Smith. She was able to move to Harlem in 1923 and was able to spark her music career there. She was a jazz musician and she performed with other top jazz artists and helped inspire many other musicians to move during the Great Migration and to follow their dreams.
In the 21st century, nearly 184 million people, or 2.3% of the world population, live outside of the country of citizenship.
I mean, today we're kind of experiencing a new Great Migration. Over 50 years, blacks have returned to the South, which is kind of surprising.
Aslan, what can you tell me about this reversal?
All I know is that it's mostly occurred in the 1990s and it's increased from there in the following decades. I think it was due to the fact that it was a movement largely led by younger, educated black men that wanted to experience their origins.
Places like Atlanta, Georgia, and Houston became more metropolitan over time, and because of that, the quality of life appealed to large groups of people.
Boy Bob, what can you tell me about the evolution of migrating and how it is now?
I think after the 13th Amendment, when slavery was abolished, there still wasn't much migration happening to begin with. Not only was it nearly impossible to move to the north before then, but I don't think the end of the Civil War changed anything, because black Americans by then were already accustomed to living in rural areas, so there would be no incentive for moving north to make sense.
Most of the reasons for black migration being at modest levels due to the farming arrangements, poverty, high levels of illiteracy, and a lack of opportunities.
But the industrialization era was the incentive that made them want to go, you know? I think after the fact that, like in the 1970s, the North had no instability and a lack of financial security to justify living in it.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, now that we've covered the 4 time periods, I think I can fully assert that migration has had huge impacts on not just the evolution of structural racism, but how we know of the United States and its geography today. It's so diverse, and there's so much we can learn from it. Migration is not only just a subcategory, but in the grand scheme of things, it's how we progress together from all the history we've left behind, and how we can make life worthwhile.
Well, guys, it's been a fun episode. Thank you for being guests for episode 15 of Hit the Road. Be sure to like and subscribe if you're watching on YouTube, and be sure to share on all platforms. It really helps the pod. Favorite if you're watching on Spotify, Apple Music, or anywhere else.
We hope you enjoy, and we'll see you in the next one.